I want you to take a second and look down at the clothes you are wearing right now. Just really look at them.
Yeah, take a close look at the fabric.
Right. Because maybe you threw on a comfortable cotton t-shirt this morning. Or maybe it's a sharply tailored button down or a patterned sweater.
We put these things on every single day without a second thought.
We really do. But those threads you are wearing, they actually carry a really heavy history. I mean, to get that simple, affordable piece of clothing onto your back, it took the birth of global empires, the invention of these world-changing mechanical marvels.
And we should add the absolute economic devastation of millions of highly skilled artisans.
Exactly. Today, we are tracing the blood, sweat, and gears of the Industrial Revolution for this deep dive. We have a fascinating stack of notes from an academic text on the history of fashion, specifically looking at the 18th and 19th centuries. And our mission today is to see exactly how the modern closet was built.
Because to truly understand the modern fashion industry, we really have to look backward. We have to look at the massive technological shifts of those centuries, the machinery that scaled production to unimaginable heights, and the vast, often brutal empires that controlled that machinery.
Yeah, fashion is definitely not just about aesthetics.
No, not at all. It is a profound map of global economics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I think we need to start by setting the scene and traveling back to the world before the mid-18th century.
Right, before the factories, before the smoke, before mass production really became a thing.
Yeah, because the reality of just getting dressed back then was completely different from what you and I experience today. Clothes were incredibly, prohibitively expensive.
Oh, absolutely. For the vast majority of human history, clothing was a massive investment. If you were part of the lower classes, you wore homespun garments.
And homespun isn't just some, quaint descriptor they used.
No, it meant exactly what it says. Fine weaves were entirely unaffordable for the average person, meaning that ordinary families had to literally manufacture their own textiles at home.
Let's actually walk through what that means, because the sheer amount of manual labor involved is staggering to think about. There was no running to a department store.
Right.
If you needed a new shirt, you couldn't just go buy fabric. You had to shear the sheep or harvest the flax yourself.
And then you had to card it.
Right, which means brushing out the fibers, right?
Exactly. You brush it all out, and then you had to sit at a spinning wheel to turn that raw fiber into usable yarn, literally thread by thread.
Wow. And then you had to set up a hand loom, weave the fabric, and finally knit or hand sew the garment together in whatever spare time you actually had.
It was an intensely intimate human-scale process. I mean, you spent hundreds of hours creating a single piece of clothing.
Hundreds of hours for one shirt.
Yeah. But then, in the mid-18th century, a massive economic shift sweeps across Western countries. The middle class begins to grow significantly stronger.
Right, they start actively participating in global trade and industry.
And with that newfound wealth, demand just skyrockets. People want more clothes, and they want higher quality weaves. England, in particular, transformed at a staggering pace to meet this hunger.
The physical geography of the country was basically rewritten. Entire towns morphed into these highly specialized hubs of production.
Yeah, Manchester's a great example of that.
Manchester practically transformed overnight from this simple market town into the absolute epicenter of the global cotton industry.
And Norwich became the beating heart of wool production.
Right, and Coventry specialized in silk.
These towns really became the engines of the Industrial Revolution. But this transition to centralized mechanized production, it wasn't a peaceful evolution.
Right, and I want to push back on the narrative of progress here for a second, because this is where the history gets really volatile. If mechanization was making clothing cheaper and easier for people to acquire, why was there such a violent backlash?
It's a fair question.
Because the sources talk about massive riots during this period. There were actual laws passed because common people were forming mobs to literally smash the machines to pieces. Why attack the very technology making clothes affordable?
Well, you have to view it through the lens of economic survival. The unrest was driven by a very immediate terror of widespread unemployment.
Right, that makes sense.
Imagine you are a traditional worker at that time. You have spent your entire life, maybe even generations of your family, mastering the craft of hand weaving.
Like it's your entire livelihood.
Exactly. And suddenly, a wealthy mill owner buys a wooden and metal contraption that can outpace you tenfold. A single machine could do the work of several men.
So your skill is instantly devalued to zero. The means to feed your family is just gone.
That is the core of it. The labor market was violently disrupted. The machines severed the connection between the artisan and the product.
But even with all that, the riots and the desperate attempts to destroy the looms, mechanization just pushed forward relentlessly anyway.
It did. And as it did, the cost of producing fabric absolutely plummeted. Prices dropped so considerably that it completely opened up the world market for English textiles.
But how do you actually drop prices that drastically? I mean, you can't just tell human weavers to work 10 times faster.
No, you have to fundamentally change the physics of how cloth is made.
Right. And that brings us to the inventions. Because these machines didn't just speed things up, they fundamentally removed the human hand from the equation.
Let's look at the processing of the raw material first. One of the most significant bottlenecks in the entire global textile industry was simply cleaning the cotton.
This is where Eli Whitney's automatic ginning machine comes in, right?
Yes, exactly.
Because before this invention, cleaning cotton was an agonizing process. We're talking about short staple cotton, where the delicate fibers are tangled tightly around dozens of tiny sticky seeds.
Right. And by hand, a person could painstakingly peel apart maybe 1 single pound of cotton fiber in an entire day.
1 pound. It was an incredible waste of human labor.
And Whitney's machine automated that entire separation process.
The mechanics of it are brilliantly simple, too. The machine essentially uses a cylinder with small wire hooks.
Yeah, and as the cylinder turns, the hooks grab the raw cotton and pull the fibers through a fine wire mesh.
But the seeds are too big to pass through the mesh, so they get left behind. By just turning a crank, you are suddenly doing the work of 50 people.
And once you have mountains of clean cotton, you can spin it and weave it on industrial looms, but, the innovation didn't stop at the fabric.
All right, we have to fast forward a bit to 1851 to look at how the garments themselves were assembled with Isaac Singer's domestic sewing machine.
Which was a monumental commercial success.
Wait, I need to understand the leap here. How does a sewing machine change the structure of the fashion industry? Wouldn't a machine just make a custom tailor sew a bespoke suit slightly faster?
Well, if it were kept in the hands of individual tailors, yes, but that isn't what happened. Singer's sewing machine took the logistical principles of the factory assembly line and applied them directly to fashion.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, when you can sew a perfectly straight, durable seam in seconds, you no longer need a master tailor measuring every individual customer.
So this is the birth of standardized sizing.
Exactly.
So instead of making one shirt for one specific person, a factory can cut 1,000 identical fabric patterns at once.
Right, and then a line of workers sitting at sewing machines simply attaches part A to part B over and over again.
Wow. It is the origin of ready-to-wear clothing sold in department stores. You can draw a direct line from Singer's machine to the modern experience of walking into a shop and just picking a medium off the rack.
Absolutely. For the first time in human history, the person making the garment had no idea who was going to want it.
That's wild to think about. And while Singer was revolutionizing the assembly line, the actual weaving of the fabric was becoming infinitely more complex. I want to talk about Joseph Jacquard.
Yes, the Jacquard loom in 1804.
Right. This was primarily used for silk, and the way it worked is just mind-blowing.
To appreciate the Jacquard loom, we kind of need to understand the basics of weaving.
Okay. Lay it out for us.
Well, you have your warp threads, which are the vertical threads pulled tight and stationary on the loom.
Okay, the vertical ones.
Right. And then you have your weft threads, which are the horizontal threads that get woven over and under the vertical ones.
And if you just weave over and under evenly, you get a plain piece of cloth.
Exactly. But if you want to create intricate, complex patterns like brocade or damask, you have to lift very specific individual vertical warp threads for every single pass of the horizontal weft thread.
And doing that by hand is painfully slow.
It is. So Jacquard automated that selection process using a brilliant physical mechanism. He recorded the complex woven patterns as a series of holes punched into a string of stiff pasteboard cards.
It's like the 19th century version of coding a software program, but for fabric?
It really is. The machine reads the card. If there's a hole, a mechanical hook passes through and lifts that specific warp thread.
And if there's no hole, the thread stays down.
Right. You swap out the deck of punch cards and the exact same machine automatically weaves a completely different pattern.
It was programmable manufacturing, decades before the concept of a computer even existed.
Yeah. But the technological boom of the era wasn't purely mechanical. It was also deeply scientific, particularly when it came to color.
Oh, let's get into the chemistry. Because before this era, dyes were entirely natural. They were derived from roots, leaves, or like crushing thousands of rare insects just to get a few drops of vibrant red or purple.
It was incredibly expensive and volatile.
So science fundamentally transformed that reality. You begin with the theoretical groundwork. The sources note that Sir Isaac Newton isolated the principal colors of the spectrum, red, yellow, and blue.
And building upon that understanding, Johann Tobias Mayer explained the mathematical principles of color mixing.
Right. This theoretical science showed textile manufacturers that there were virtually limitless possibilities for new combinations.
And the massive practical breakthrough happens in 1856. Sir William Perkin invents the very first synthetic dye.
He actually synthesized it from coal tar, didn't he?
He did. Suddenly, humanity is no longer reliant on harvesting rare organic materials to make our clothes colorful. We can engineer vibrant, permanent colors entirely in a laboratory.
Wow. If we connect this to the bigger picture...
You have a perfect storm.
Right.
You have the cotton gin processing raw material at lightning speed. You have jacquard looms weaving complex patterns automatically. You have Singer sewing machines churning out finished, standardized garments.
And you have Perkins synthetic dyes making everything brilliantly colored.
Exactly.
But this massive, hungry technological beast required raw materials. I mean, the scale of production meant the factories in England had an insatiable appetite for raw cotton. And the way that demand was met is one of the darkest chapters of global history.
It is. The boom in the English cotton industry actively fueled and accelerated the global slave trade.
Yeah, the sources make that very clear.
The mechanism of this economy was brutally efficient. English mills manufactured cotton cloth, and that cloth was transported via ships to the coast of Africa. There, the textiles were used as currency to barter for enslaved human beings.
And those enslaved people were then packed into ships and transported across the Atlantic to the American South. They were forced under brutal conditions to work the fields, planting and harvesting the raw cotton.
And then those same ships would return to England loaded with that raw cotton, feeding the mills to make more cloth.
It was a triangular trade route built entirely on human exploitation.
The very fabrics that revolutionized European clothing making, previously exclusive materials like lightweight batiste, sheer muslin, and delicate gauze widely available to the middle class, were inextricably linked to immense human suffering.
And that exploitation extended heavily to the consumer markets as well. Because once your factories produce millions of yards of cloth, you inevitably saturate your domestic market.
You need new people to buy it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. And that takes us to the other side of the globe, India. Because before the Industrial Revolution, India was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the textile world.
Oh, without a doubt. For centuries, India's economy was anchored by its legendary weavers.
The quality of Indian textiles was the global standard for excellence. We are talking about fabrics so incredibly fine and beautifully dyed that Indian cotton was literally used as currency to trade for spices across the world.
So how does a global superpower of manufacturing lose its crown? The history here hinges on colonialism.
Right. The historical records specifically note a massive turning point when India was ceded to Britain by the Treaty of Paris in 1898.
Under British colonial rule, the entire centuries-old structure of the Indian textile economy was systematically dismantled.
The traditional patronage systems completely collapsed, didn't they?
They did. For generations, wealthy temples and royal courts had supported these master artisans, allowing them to spend months perfecting a single piece of intricate fabric. The colonial government eradicated that support structure.
But the British didn't just passively let the industry fade. They actively reversed India's role in the world. They took India from being the world's absolute largest exporter of fine textiles and forcibly transformed it into the biggest importer of English-made cloth.
It is essential to understand the economic mechanics of how they achieved this. The British domestic market was protected. They imposed exorbitant tariffs on any Indian textiles entering Britain, making them too expensive to buy.
But simultaneously, they forced India to accept British goods completely tariff-free.
Exactly.
So the factories in Lancashire, England, are taking raw cotton shipped from the colonies, mass-producing cheap, industrial knockoffs of traditional Indian patterns, and dumping them back into the Indian domestic market at prices the local artisans couldn't possibly compete with.
Furthermore, the colonial government enacted stringent taxes specifically targeting the local handloom weavers. They essentially criminalized the traditional craft by taxing the artisans into absolute poverty.
The human cost of these policies was apocalyptic. If you went to famous weaving centers during this time, Places like Surat and Murshidabad that had been globally renowned for generations, you would see entire communities facing starvation.
The economic hardship was so immense that certain complex traditional hand-weaving techniques went entirely extinct. The artisans died, and their generational knowledge died with them.
It was the deliberate, calculated destruction of an indigenous manufacturing base.
Britain needed the raw materials from its East Indian colonies, and it needed those exact same colonies to serve as a captive dependent market to buy back the industrially finished goods.
But the sharp irony here is that while the British government was actively starving out India's master weavers, European high society was becoming completely obsessed with Indian aesthetics.
It's a wild contradiction. They were destroying the creators, but they desperately wanted the look and feel of Indian textiles.
The consumer demand in Europe was enormous. British and French women's fashion profited immensely from the aesthetic inspiration of these colonial imports.
They absolutely craved delicate Indian muslins, which is an ultra-fine, breathable cotton and brightly printed calico fabrics.
You also see a massive craze for Kashmiri shawls. These were woven using complex khani weaves, where artisans used small wooden sticks instead of a shuttle to create incredibly intricate, colorful patterns.
Those Khani shawls became the ultimate luxury status symbol in European high society.
France developed such a sweeping, massive interest in printed, painted, and dyed Indian calicos that they simply referred to the style as Indiens.
The visual language of Indian textiles, the intricate flowing florals, the lightweight drapes, the brilliant colors, completely captivated and transformed Western fashion.
It captivated them so deeply that it actually permanently changed the English language. I mean, we use so many words globally today that come directly from this era of Indian influence.
Oh, the vocabulary is fascinating.
Let's look at it. Chintz, which you usually think of today as that slightly outdated floral upholstery fabric, actually derives directly from the Indian word chint, which translates beautifully to a spray of raindrops.
It perfectly describes the delicate, scattered floral patterns that European markets were so desperate to replicate.
There are so many more, too. The word pajama comes directly from this era. The concept of lightweight, comfortable trousers was an Indian export.
Right.
Khaki, jodhpurs, even kamarband, which the West adopted as the cummerbund worn with tuxedos.
What is most fascinating here is the permanence of this cultural exchange. The Industrial Revolution physically relocated the center of global textile manufacturing.
Yeah.
Through mechanization and colonial policy, it moved the economic power away from the traditional artisans of Asia and consolidated it in the mechanized, smoke-filled factory towns of Europe.
The West took the industry, but the East provided the enduring aesthetic soul of modern clothing. The prioritization of comfort, the vibrant dyes, the draped fabrics, all of that overwrote Western fashion sensibilities forever.
It did. So when we synthesize all of this, what do we find?
So what does this all mean? We started by looking at a world where everyone was spinning their own yarn by the fire, spending weeks just trying to make enough rough cloth to stay warm. We traced the violent, disruptive birth of mechanized looms and the chemical miracles of synthetic dyes.
We saw how the insatiable hunger of those new machines fueled the transatlantic slave trade, and we examined the deliberate economic policies that devastated India's ancient weaving centers.
It is a history of unparalleled human ingenuity and brilliant engineering, existing right alongside profound exploitation and suffering. And the result of all that collision, all that invention, and all that tragedy is the cross-cultural, globalized wardrobe that we all share today.
Think back to that shirt you looked at when we first began this deep dive. Your modern, affordable, ready-to-wear closet is not just a collection of fabric. It is the direct, physical descendant of Isaac Singer's sewing machine.
It carries the ghost of the vanished, starved-out artisanal techniques of 19th century Surat.
It is a product of a global revolution.
Every time you pick a size medium off a rack, you are participating in a system of standardized, alienated labor that was invented 170 years ago.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, building on something we discussed earlier about the mechanisms of these inventions.
Oh, like where this is going.
We talked about Joseph Jacquard's loom in 1804 and how it used a system of recording woven patterns on stiff pasteboard cards with holes punched in them.
Right, the 19th century software analogy.
Exactly. That relatively simple mechanical method of using a hole or the absence of a hole to control a machine was revolutionary. It eventually evolved and was modified directly into computer punch cards in the mid-20th century.
Wait, really?
Yes. That means the foundational logic of computing, The binary system of ones and zeros, holes and no holes that ultimately led to the digital age started in the textile industry.
Oh, wow.
The very digital device you are using to stream this audio right now fundamentally owes its existence to a 200-year-old mechanical silk loom.
That is just incredible. Next time you get dressed, remember the empires, the brilliant inventors, and the forgotten weavers woven into those threads.